What advice would I give about teaching difficult histories?
Openly acknowledging with students that what we're doing is tricky stuff.
By recognising that you may have a limitation in this space.
You want to do it well. And so that takes planning.
Set protocols up in the classroom.
Don't teach difficult lessons on a Friday.
Hi, and welcome to Hey History Teacher, a series of evidence-backed tips and advice to help you teach history at primary or high school. You'll hear from expert history teachers and university educators across Australia. In this episode, what are difficult histories? How can you encourage and manage discussion on difficult topics? And what's one thing you can do to make these classes easier to teach?
Let's find out!
I'm your host, Anna Clark, a professor of history and someone who's passionate about history and history education. We've teamed up with the History Teachers Association of New South Wales to make this professional development resource for you. There are 8 episodes, around 30 minutes each, with free tip sheets and links for every episode on our website, heyhistory.net. First, let's get on the same page about difficult histories. What does difficult history mean? Queensland teacher Sarah Coleman has an interesting take on what history is difficult.
My name is Sarah Coleman. I am the Head of Humanities and Social Sciences at MacKillop Catholic College in Mount Peter, which is in far north Queensland, just south of Cairns. And I'm also on the management committee for the Queensland History Teachers Association. Contested histories are a core part of what we do as history teachers, and obviously difficult histories tend to fall into that category. And all history, I think, is difficult history. And it's more difficult at certain points in time than others.
So Sarah has this idea that all history is difficult history. But of course, as she also acknowledges, there are differences in that degree of difficulty, but the challenges they pose can be different. And a history can be difficult even when it's well known and uncontested. The concept of difficult history is a recognised term in history teaching in Australia and internationally. As a historian, a definition of difficult histories that I use is historical narratives that include oppression, violence or trauma. As teacher Megan Tucker puts it,
Difficult histories are difficult for a reason. They challenge people's perspectives on the world and they challenge their beliefs.
Let's break down that idea of difficult history into some of its elements. They challenge widely accepted versions of a community or a nation's past and values. And difficult histories connect with questions or problems facing us now. They make us question how we understand the past and the present. And difficult histories often elicit strong emotional reactions from us as teachers and, of course, our students. There are a lot, but as the teachers you'll hear from say, difficult histories matter. They're essential to teach. Here's Christine Abadier, a teacher in New South Wales.
Hello, my name is Christine Abadier. I'm the current head of history at Tara Anglican School for Girls, which is an ELC to Year 12 school in North Parramatta in Sydney. I've been teaching for 11 years, most of which has been history teaching. I absolutely think that difficult histories have a place in the history classroom. They're really necessary for developing empathy and critical thinking skills and helping students to understand different perspectives of the past and of the world that they're in as well. It also helps students understand their current world by knowing about the difficult histories of the past. And I think that if we leave out difficult histories, it actually distorts our understanding of what happened. Obviously, there's challenges with that. I think we have to be a little bit culturally sensitive sometimes when we're teaching, and that some of what we teach might cause distress to students. But I still absolutely think that it's necessary that we do teach it as well.
Victorian teacher Ben Lawless adds that school is the only place where many of our students might encounter these histories.
I feel like the classroom is the only place where everybody in society has to go through. Like, I think about the influence that young people have in their local communities and in their families, and they're all fantastic, but they aren't necessarily going to hear about these difficult histories. Like, they're never going to get over the great silence that we have about Australian history if they don't hear it in school, because that's the only place where it's compulsory.
The Australian curriculum for both primary and secondary school has 4 content areas that could be considered difficult histories. They are the colonisation of Australia, including the frontier wars and stolen generations; wars, conflict and colonialism, including the World Wars, the Holocaust, the atomic bombing of Japan and the slave trade; industrial and social change, including the Industrial Revolution, migration and convicts; and rights, freedoms and citizenship, including First Nations, civil rights campaigns, women's rights campaigns, and the rights of children. I admit that's a very modern history list. Sorry to all the ancient history teachers out there teaching about Vikings and gladiators. And as Sarah Coleman points out, ancient history is full of narratives about violence, oppression and trauma too, as well as histories that we might not define as difficult.
I think there's a certain perception that the further removed we become from some histories, the easier it gets. But I don't necessarily agree with that either, because I think increasingly as historians review and they revise histories and perspectives that have been silenced come to the fore, or, further archaeological evidence comes through, or different ways of looking at things. I certainly think back to my own high school ancient history experience. The word genocide was not used to describe what Julius Caesar did in Gaul. But now that is a very common approach to how we think about the Gallic campaigns in terms of the human cost. But you don't often think about, say, the battle for Troy and the Trojan War as a difficult history. You think of it as myth and legend, but you dig and you find out what happened to the women when the Greeks broke in and raped and pillaged, literally. It can be really easy to gloss over movements like first and second wave feminism as not being traumatic histories. We do the suffragettes as part of our grade 10 history extension program. And what we focus on is looking at suffragettes and suffragists, but the extent to which they could be considered terrorists and were deemed as terrorists at that particular point in time, but the extent to which people were prepared to go to keep them in their boxes. So the concept of being force-fed and the story of the races when she walks out in front of the horses because it's all being filmed, there's really full-on moments in all of that. And it gets to the same when we come through to the 70s and then into Me Too.
So what's best practice when it comes to teaching difficult history? West Australian teacher Louise Secker says it's making a safe environment and building trust with our students.
Hi, my name's Louise Secker. I'm a history teacher at Perth Modern School and the head of department there. And previously I've taught in a range of government schools around Western Australia, including Eastern Goldfields in Kalgoorlie. First and foremost, for teachers, you need to build trust with your students and create a safe environment. They need to trust that you will listen respectfully and that you will intervene appropriately, that you'll set protocols up in the classroom. You need to allow students to work through their own thoughts without being criticised and dismissed by their peers. So I think it's really important that you are honest with the students that aspects of history can be uncomfortable, but it's not about apportioning blame. It's actually about getting a better insight into aspects of our past that would be convenient if we push them under the carpet, but we see them rearing their heads again and again in different time periods, in different contexts. And I think that teachers just need to embrace difficult histories, but also acknowledge that they are teaching young adolescents and they need to build a really good relationship because the students need to trust teachers that they will do the right thing and that they will manage a class appropriately to having a strong relationship with the students in order for people to have the space to be able to discuss and to listen if they wish to.
Know your students. Know them so you can be sensitive and attuned, and so you can invite them to share. Here's Sarah Coleman again.
So it's really about knowing your learners. It's about knowing the young people in front of you and their backgrounds, and having a chat with your year co or your head of house, however it's structured, going, I'm about to teach this topic. Any kids that this is going to flag for? I know this and this one have been having a tough time. Is this going to be triggering? And I think that's our job as teachers in terms of those safe spaces. So I think one of the best resources we have are the people around us.
Safety is a word that comes up a lot in teaching difficult histories, and the Safely In, Safely Out framework is recommended by West Australian teacher Louise Secker.
So a key resource my colleagues and I use at the schools that I've taught at aligns with the Safely In, Safely Out pedagogy from the Yad Vashem International School for Holocaust Studies. The idea behind it is that you go safely in with using human stories and relatable experiences and the historical context before actually going into some of the more confronting aspects of the history, and you need to use age-appropriate sources and language for your students. The Safely Out is at the end of the session, you really are looking at allowing time for the students to reflect on what they've learned, ask any questions, and to really address any issues, but then also make connections to the ideas of human resilience and the fact that there is life after what has actually happened.
Louise adds that the experience of certain histories as difficult can differ from student to student, which is why it's so important to get to know them.
So sometimes students can quite easily intellectualise a topic, and what we think is being very difficult, they actually can consume in an intellectual way very easily because they haven't necessarily responded emotionally to it because they don't have a connection.
And what about when your students do come from backgrounds with difficult histories, such as migrants or refugees, First Nations students, or perhaps students living with violence or housing precarity? Here's Sarah Coleman.
Where we are in Cairns, we have one of the highest First Nations populations of the Catholic schools in Cairns. So we have lots of students that come from very difficult histories, but are also quite forthcoming about sharing their views on that. And that's really important as well, that they feel safe enough in a classroom space to be able to actually go, no, you're not thinking about that properly, because in my family, this is what this looked like. And I would hope that in different parts around Australia where you've got different makeup, racially, ethnically, religiously, that students are afforded that same opportunity in classrooms to be able to have those conversations with essentially a mediator, because all our students are trying to do is to problem solve and find, I guess, the answers for the way that they view the world.
Louise Secker adds that knowing your students also gives you the opportunity to connect to their experiences across other difficult histories.
I was talking to some students in regards to stolen generation and dislocation, and I was making a comparison with other time periods in history where young children have been taken away from their families and that sense of dislocation. And I was using the example of the children who were airlifted from Vietnam at the end of the Vietnam War, and they people who what was considered at that time to be an act of good faith by the Australian government and so forth to actually bring children that they thought were orphans to Australia, and what implications that then had for those people coming to Australia and then growing up in Australia in a very white Australia at the time in the 70s. You don't want to trivialise the experience of groups of people by saying, oh, look, lots of people have had the same experience. But I think for students to build some kind of empathy and to have a greater understanding, if you can leverage an experience that the students either have or they have family members and that they've discussed this at home or they've observed it, I think it's really powerful to do so.
One starting point for students sharing stories is family history, suggests Queensland teacher Natalie Fong.
My name is Natalie Fong. I am the Head of Humanities at City Point Christian College. I am a history and an English teacher. I try to get the students as well to share from their own family history. So one activity is a map on the wall in the classroom, and the students will share about their family's journey to Australia, because no one didn't necessarily have an easy journey or a sort of linear journey. Often you might have come via a couple of different countries. So I print out the little photographs of their faces and I stick them on. This is where I was born. And then we would use bits of wool to chart their journey or their family's journey to Australia, and they might write a little explanation about how their family came to Australia. And it's such an interesting activity because they surprise each other. Maybe a Chinese student who was born in Canada and came to Australia from Canada, nobody really knew that. Or someone who came from Russia. So they get to hear each other's stories and really making the point that unless you have First Nation ancestry, everybody came here from somewhere.
When your classroom feels safe and you're investing in relationships with your students, even teaching them difficult histories, they can surprise you. Here's South Australian teacher Paul Foley.
I've taught in country Victoria for 20 years, and now I'm teaching in metropolitan Adelaide. There are so many layers to our students. So when they can come to school and but be and embrace all that it is to be a student, I think for many of our young people, it's a feeling of safety and a place where they can relax and be themselves. There's a real liberty that comes with a student being able to share in that room. And the other thing is, in that environment, you have to be a sense of not every student wants to share that with the rest of the class. I mean, the classic would be also be attuned to how students want to demonstrate their learning. There are some students that the written task, the written response it's not going to work. But can I do an interview on it? Yes, you can. Of course you can. Let's do it that way. And there's a sense of relief. Some years ago, we were doing Indigenous histories and cross-referencing between the Australian and the North American scenario and dislocation, and the students would do a presentation to the rest of the class. And this student said, well, actually, I did something different. I composed a piece of music that I thought reflected the pain and the sense of loss, the loss of connection with land of these Indigenous peoples. And at that point, as a teacher, you've got a bit of a marking sheet, you just put it down and you go, no, this is transcended. And they are moments to cherish. They really are. I'll never forget that lesson, actually, because you glance to the side and you look at the other students and they're just in awe. They're going, gosh, wow. Creativity, just depth of understanding. And it's just, they're magic moments. The key thing in teaching, longevity in teaching, is hold on to those great moments and replicate them and use them to energise yourself.
We've reached the halfway point in the episode, so have a break if you'd like. So far, we've covered what difficult histories are, both as a definition and as content in the curriculum you might be using. And teachers gave advice on teaching difficult histories, starting with know your students and using the safely in, safely out principles.
Creating a safe environment.
Going, I'm about to teach this topic. Any kids that this is going to flag for. Students as well to share from their own family history.
Allowing time for the students to reflect on what they've learned.
Be attuned to how students want to demonstrate their learning.
Welcome back if you took a break. Australian colonial history has difficult histories that are now included in the Australian curriculum, as well as the curriculum in each of the states and territories, like the Australian Wars, including certain massacres, and experiences such as the stolen generations. Our episode on teaching the Australian Wars with Rachel Perkins, Professor Marcia Langton and the history teacher Bill Lewis, as well as our episode connecting to country through school and syllabus, have advice on teaching some of those difficult histories. We also asked Jojo Rungman and Associate Professor Al Fricker for his advice to non-Indigenous teachers.
Hi everyone, my name is Associate Professor Al Fricker. I'm a very proud Jojo Rungman and I am an academic at the Nokia Institute at Deakin University. I am a scholar of history and also a former history teacher, and I do a lot of research in Australian history teaching as well.
Al acknowledges that many teachers are nervous about teaching Indigenous history.
We have had generations of teachers who have had very little experience being taught Indigenous knowledge, and as a result have a lack of confidence and a lack of skill as to what that would look like should they start doing it. And so the outcome is we tend to perpetuate those same cycles. And let me be very clear, this is not a failure of teachers. This is not a failure of the sector or of individuals or anything. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad.
Historians and teachers alike have struggled with this, and I can certainly say from experience that it's difficult standing up in front of a room full of students talking and teaching about First Nations history and wondering if you have the authority to speak and if you're going to say the right or the wrong thing. But you also have to think, what would happen if I say nothing? What silences might be perpetuated? And Al gives some great advice for how we should step up and step into that space in good faith. Like historian Henry Reynolds famously called his book, Why Weren't We Told? Al Fricker suggests to recognise your own limitations in the education you got or the skills and knowledge you have, reflect and then respond. Do something about it. If you can, draw on your school's reconciliation action plan, link up with local First Nations groups, and take the time to research some of the incredible resources authored by First Nations people that can help us teach this history with compassion and empathy.
There are ways that non-Indigenous teachers can engage with Indigenous histories. It's by recognising that you may have a limitation in this space, but you have the capacity to learn and to grow. We have to move our students into that third paradigm, which is the doing. So we need to empower them. We need to encourage them to recognise that not being Indigenous means that they have a significant amount of power and privilege, and they also have a significant amount of responsibility.
You can hear more of Al Fricker, including how to work with community and how to choose resources for teaching Indigenous histories, including difficult history, in episode 6 of this series, Connecting to Country. And remember, episode 8 is on teaching the Australian Wars, where experts share their advice about stepping into that space of teaching First Nations history, even if you're feeling nervous. Next, as a teacher, how do you manage the conversations and the curly questions that come up with teaching difficult histories? Louise Secker says to set up the classroom so that you can have discussion at any time, and this means setting out some guidelines or rules.
The first one is that people need to not interrupt. You need to really have the students listen and reflect. I like students to write down a question and have some pause time between when one person has spoken. You definitely don't want to have one or two students dominate. So I normally set up guidelines in terms of you can ask a clarifying question, and that's a maximum of 2 questions that you can actually pose. Getting students to write down their question enables them some time to think, and then asking them, looking at your question, would it be something you would be comfortable to answer? I've got some brilliant colleagues who use a technique whereby they actually anonymously can put a question into a big hat so that then you can draw out the questions so the teacher can sort of vet the questions.
The other thing that I like doing is sticky notes for questions that they've got, because not all students I don't know what other people's classes are like. I'm sure they're pretty similar. You tend to have a handful of voices that like to dominate. The very, what's the word? Passionate ones. And sometimes there's other students who want to say or ask or contribute. So I have a pile of sticky notes and they can jot things down on the sticky notes and they just leave them on the desks. And then I'll go around and pick them up. And if there's anything that comes out of that, we'll obviously address it in the next lesson.
What about those tricky questions from students? We've all had them. Sarah Coleman says that unpacking a student's question rather than shutting it down is a way to facilitate a safe conversation.
We are the people who are able to facilitate safe conversations, to be able to check certain ways of thinking and kind of go, not that that's wrong, but maybe you want to tell me more about that. Like, how have you gotten to that point of view? Like, unpack that is what I tend to go, like, tell me more. So instead of just shutting kids down and going, well, no, that's racist or that's this or that's that. Because I think if that's how you respond, they're more likely to completely shut down and then they're not going to share anything. And if they have interpretations of history that are potentially not helpful, you don't then have the scope to help reshape the way that they think and not necessarily tell them that they're wrong, but challenge the way that they're thinking and go, well, tell me why. Tell me more about that. Like, have you got any evidence? Like, what have you got? Like, help me. Like, there's always, modern history's classic for like your conspiracy theorists. And they'll always want to come through with a conspiracy theory. And you're like, all right, tell me more about that, to be able to then have that in the context of a broader classroom discussion and reshape that and get them to critically evaluate why they're viewing the world or the past the way that they are. I think is really important that they have that skill set, because one of the things that we want, isn't it, is critical thinkers, is people who aren't just going to take everything at face value, particularly with the AI reinventions of all the things. It's really important that we're giving them those skills or giving them the opportunity to test them in a safe environment.
Sarah says that sometimes, no matter how sensitive and attuned you're trying to be to your students, the content of difficult histories can be upsetting.
I've had students who have had to stand and go, Miss, they just can stand up and walk outside and go and get a drink of water and have a breather, and they can come back in when they're ready. But not all of them do. So occasionally you'll get the parent email that goes, oh, look, you weren't aware, but this particular topic really upset my kid and this is why, just so you know. And then you're just like, oh, man, really? I feel so bad. And that has an impact on us as teachers, because increasingly we're then aware of the experiences of the kids in our classes, and this is the world that they're living in too, and the way that these sorts of events have impacted them and their families, whether you're dealing in intergenerational trauma or their own personal trauma, this stuff carries. And I think it's worth acknowledging with them that it does and that it hurts. And that's okay.
We've got 2 final tips on teaching difficult histories. The first is from Christine Abadier. It's actually about your timetable.
I was looking at something to do with difficult histories and just getting ideas of, how to approach. And it's just a fact sheet, and that has a list of do's, it has a list of don'ts. And once again, you may not need to apply all of them, but they're suggestions of how to approach it. So one of their suggestions was, don't teach difficult lessons on a Friday, because you want to give students the time to process, but you want them to come back with their questions, the next day or the following a couple of days, as opposed to having the weekend to digest everything. So even something simple like that, that's really important in terms of just little strategies that might help.
You can find that fact sheet of tips on the Hey History website. And the other tip is take care of yourself. Teaching content that involves oppression, violence and trauma can take its toll on you too as a teacher. Here's Christine Abadier and Sarah Coleman.
The last thing I think that's really important is that teachers have time to debrief if they've taught something in their class that has been difficult, or just have a sounding board.
It's probably not great, but I think to a degree as history teachers we do become, I don't know if desensitized is the right word, but I think we probably all build some sort of like internal regulation coping mechanism. I think going back to a staff room where you're able to debrief with your colleagues So myself, and then I've got an early career teacher who's my other grade 10 teacher. We'll sit in the staff room and go, right, how did your guys manage it? And she'll be like, oh, I've got this question, this question, this question. I wasn't sure about this. Or she'll come back really positive because it's been really great and the kids have really engaged. Just having that space where you're able to talk things through. I think we all probably feel pretty heavy by the end of term, or you get to the end of the unit, you'll be like, oh, that was a lot. But there's also, geez, they managed that so well. Gee, they were engaged. I'm so impressed with how they're thinking about this now versus how they were thinking about it at the beginning. And I think coming at it from a student-facing perspective, seeing what they write, seeing how they approach it, that kind of takes the weight away a little bit. They've come away better, more empathetic, more critically thinking young humans than they were when you started it.
So, to recap on tips for teaching difficult histories, in the last half of this episode, teachers talked about these skills.
There are ways that non-Indigenous teachers can engage with Indigenous histories, and you have the capacity to learn and to grow.
Getting students to write down their question enables them some time to think.
Not that that's wrong, but maybe you want to tell me more about that.
Teachers have time to debrief.
I'm Anna Clark, and you've been listening to Hey History Teacher. A huge thanks to all the teachers we spoke to for this series.
Sarah Coleman,
Ben Lawless,
Natalie Fong,
Al Fricker,
Paul Foley,
Louise Secker,
Christine Abadier.
Get a tipsheet summary of this episode on our website, heyhistory.net, and follow Hey History in your podcast app. This episode and the whole professional development series is funded by the History Teachers Association of New South Wales. Special thanks to Jonathan Dallimore. Hey History Teacher is produced by Jane Curtis at UTS Impact Studios. The executive producer of this series is Anna Clark. This podcast was made on Gadigal country in Sydney, Australia. Thanks for listening.